The stories you're about to hear come from England in the late 1300s, a time when life was hard, short, and often ended in unexpected ways. They're based on real coroners' rolls, official records made when people died suddenly or suspiciously. The clerks who recorded them weren't trying to tell stories. They were simply writing the facts quickly and briefly as they could, then move on. To make those statements come alive, I filled in context, character, and reasonable detail. The result is storytelling rooted in real events, shaped from the truth, and fully possible as told. The arrow that came back. If you lived in medieval England, there was one rule that everyone understood, even if no one ever said it out loud. If a crowd gathered for alcohol and good-natured fun, someone usually left with a bruise. If someone introduced a weapon, the bruise sometimes came with a burial. This story takes place in the early 1300s in the village of Isham, England, on St. Peter's Day, a religious holiday that usually began with prayer and sober reflection, and often ended with people doing things they would later insist were not their idea. That morning, the villagers gathered inside the small stone church for the feast day service. Among them was Thomas Clerk, the son of a carpenter from Northampton. At some point during the service, however, he was seen slipping quietly out the back of the church and did not return. Whether he was restless, distracted, or simply uninterested, no one can say by the time the final prayers ended and the afternoon festivities began. Thomas was already well on his way to being two sheets to the wind, holding what might generously be called a front row seat to the village spectacle known as Le Wrestling. Despite the name, Le Wrestling was not a sport in any organized sense. There were no rules, no referees, and no agreed definition of winning. It was simply a group of men attempting to throw each other into the dirt while a crowd watched, drank ale, and shouted advice. People came in from nearby villages to watch. Some came to wrestle. Some came to drink, and some came because nothing else was happening, which in medieval England was usually reason enough. Thomas had no intention of wrestling. He had come to watch, which, as it turned out, was a dangerous misunderstanding of how safe watching actually was. The wrestling went on for hours. Men grappled, stumbled, and fell into the dirt. Some matches ended quickly, while others dragged on until both participants were exhausted and the crowd lost interest. Tempers flared, insults escalated, and ale disappeared at a steady pace. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas grew increasingly confident in his commentary. At one point, he openly mocked a particularly clumsy pair of wrestlers, loudly suggesting that if skill mattered half as much as shouting, the match would already be decided. The remark drew laughter from those nearby, which only encouraged him to shout louder taunts. For a small group standing just beyond the edge of the green, the wrestling lost its novelty. Earlier, several young men had been practicing archery at makeshift targets nearby. By now, those targets were splintered, broken, or simply no longer usable. One of the archers still held his bow loosely as a few bystanders gathered around. Thomas joined them. "If you are going to shoot," he said confidently, "at least shoot properly. It would be a miracle for you to hit a full-sized oak tree." The archer just shook his head, recognizing the drunken man for what he was. When Thomas reached for a bow and arrow, they merely scoffed and stepped aside to watch. Like most Englishmen of the time, Thomas was adequate at archery and knew how to shoot, and declared that he would show them how it was done. He planted his feet carefully, knocked the arrow, and took a confident stance. And, only swaying slightly, he pulled the string back. But instead of aiming for one of the battered targets, he tilted his head back and aimed at some birds flying overhead. A brief hush settled over the small crowd as Thomas released his arrow. Straight up, the arrow shot upward past the birds, not hitting any. The crowd followed it with their eyes as it rose, becoming smaller and smaller against the blue sky. Someone murmured approval. Thomas lowered the bow with a satisfied expression as conversation resumed. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a thin whistling that seemed detached from the moment. It grew louder, closer, faster. Several people looked up, however. Thomas did not. The arrow returned straight down and struck Thomas Clerk right in the head. For a moment, there was confusion more than panic. It did not seem possible. Thomas staggered and instinctively reached up, touching the shaft protruding from his skull as though trying to understand how it had arrived there. Someone shouted for help, and another shouted to pull the arrow out. Without hesitation, someone grabbed the shaft and yanked it free, because in medieval England, medical reasoning often followed a simple principle: if something does not belong inside the body, remove it. Remarkably, Thomas did not collapse. He insisted he was fine, mostly. He could speak, though now with a slight slur. He could walk with assistance, though he kept wandering to the left. Those around him took into account that he had been drinking and wrote it off as drunkenness, so they led him home to recover. Over the next several days, he appeared to improve. The wound began to close, and the village moved on from the event. What had seemed miraculous survival became a story retold with nervous laughter. About a week later, however, Thomas became gravely ill. He developed a fever and grew disoriented. His speech deteriorated into confused murmurs, and the wound became inflamed. In an age before antibiotics or an understanding of infection, what had seemed survivable quietly turned fatal. Not long after, Thomas Clerk was found dead in his bed. An inquest was held. Jurors were sworn in, and witnesses carefully recounted the events. It was determined that he had brought about his own death through pride and reckless conduct, leaving the church service early to drink, mocking others, and aiming toward the heavens to prove himself. In medieval justice, the visible injury was not always considered the true cause of death. What mattered more was the moral chain of events that preceded it. If a man acted in pride and calamity followed, the court did not see mere accident. It saw judgment. Thomas was therefore judged not to have been killed by an arrow into his skull, but by his own actions and the irreverence they represented.